Our gospel reading today is from Mark chapter 9. I want to emphasize chapter 9 because last week Pastor Kevin read from chapter 8, and you're going to hear a few phrases repeated here in chapter 9. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into human hands. They will kill him. After 3 days, he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When Jesus was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." Jesus took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, Jesus said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. So let me start with a picture. It is a picture that captures a moment. A 2-year-old girl. Oh, that's my granddaughter Lily. A 2-year-old girl in a pretty white dress. Years ago, we would have called it your Sunday best. Little girl, clean, sparkling dress, holding out mulch and dirt. And it looks like probably she has reached down with both hands and picked up and now holds out for the camera mulch and dirt. So you look at the contrast, the pretty clean dress and the mulch and dirt, and you just wonder, will the dress stay clean or will it be mulched shortly after the picture is taken? You never know, because one thing we do know is that children can be a mess. My wife Lucinda was about that same age, about a year older perhaps, and her mom said, "You can go outside, but don't get your clothes dirty." So at 3.5, she took off her clothes, folded them up neatly, put them by the fence, ran, jumped in, and wallowed in a huge mud puddle. But the clothes were clean. Kids can be a mess when they're little, they get dirty. When they are teenagers, they go in their room and listen to music their parents don't like. And their parents will say, "That music will mess up your head, kids." And they say, yeah. Which is a conversation that's gone on for several generations, by the way. Children can be messy. Adults can be messy. Adults, you and I could list a few things, but we're not going to because there are children here. Adults could list a few things that they've messed up in life, at work. We have all messed up some relationships. Many people look at this election year and say, "What a mess. How did we get to this messy place?" And in today's gospel, the disciples are a mess. They are messing up in a couple of ways. For one thing, Jesus has just said that he is going to have to suffer and die and then will rise again alive. We're thinking, didn't Jesus already say that? Yes, he did. Back in chapter 8, Pastor Kevin read it last Sunday. You've heard it already. And now Jesus says it again, and again the disciples nod their heads as Jesus is talking, and not one of them understands a thing about dying and rising. And like most of us, the disciples don't want to be stupid. They don't want to look like they're stupid in the presence of the others. They don't want to ask what he meant. So they decide they'll just hang back and talk about something else. You know, if you're confused or if you're scared, well, act like nothing's wrong. Just change the subject. It's the great Christian thing we all like to do. Just don't talk about it. Instead, talk about stuff that makes you feel big and strong. That always works, doesn't it? Well, that led to the next mess, because as they are walking along, the disciples are playing the game of who's the greatest of them all. Who is the most valuable player? Instead of denying themselves and taking up their crosses, which we heard Jesus say last week, instead, they are affirming themselves. They are boasting. They are each saying and arguing, I'm better than you. Anything you can do, I can do better. Jesus, of course, notices that they're hanging back behind him. He notices that because they keep saying, shh, not so loud, he'll hear us. Well, Jesus, of course, already knows what they're talking about. He's Jesus. So when they get inside the house, Jesus stretches his arms, he yawns, and then he sits down and he says, hey guys, what were you arguing about on the road? They freeze up, of course. The guilt in them just grabs hold of their voice box, won't let them say a word. I mean, they were not talking about what poor they were going to take care of tomorrow. They were not naming people who might need special prayers at this time. They were talking smack about being great and the greatest. And so now here they stand before Jesus, and at least they know enough to be embarrassed. Isn't that a good first step? Know enough when to be embarrassed. And so Jesus says to them, you want first place? Take last place. Be servant of all. That's greatness, he says. That is true greatness, being last, being servant. Instead of the boss with the sauce, instead of the one who's calling all the shots, be servant. Didn't Jesus already say that? Yes, last week when Pastor Kevin was reading the gospel, Jesus said very much the same thing. He's repeating. Education experts tell us that repetition is vital for learning. And so Jesus repeats again and again. Jesus keeps telling about God's kingdom reversals. How the things that we think and value, God turns upside down. The first will be last, Jesus says. The greatest will be the servant. Those who lose their life for the sake of the gospel will gain life. What will it profit you if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Said it last Sunday, said it this Sunday. Who knows how many more times Jesus will need to say those things. Then Jesus invents the children's message. You wonder where that came from? Right here. Jesus invents the children's message. He takes up a little child in his arms. Wait a minute. Where did a child come from? He was teaching his disciples, specifically the 12 apostles, plus some were outside. Well, I don't know. Maybe it belonged to one of the women who were following him. Maybe this was the child of one of the 12 apostles. Maybe this is Jesus' niece or nephew. It does tell us Jesus was back home. He was living in Capernaum at the time, and it says he's back home. Whoever the child was, Jesus takes the child in his arms. They wanted to know who's greatest, so Jesus will show them. The greatest is about 26 inches tall, limited vocabulary, zero net worth, no status, no influence. Now today, kids are very visible. Children, in fact, in today's society are often adored. That was not the case 2,000 years ago. In the first century, adults ignored anyone shorter than their kneecaps. Just completely ignored them. Children were basically invisible. They were considered non-persons. In fact, children were considered property. There was no market for adorable in those days. There was no market for, isn't he or she cute? No market for that at all. People had children, so when the children grew up, they could help them work in their middle ages. And when they got old, the children, who now adults, could take care of them in their old age. So basically, in the first century, back then, children were nobodies until they grew up and were useful. So Jesus puts a child, the one society considered nobody, Jesus puts a child in the center of the room. Jesus always loved children. He paid attention to children. Jesus always knew what was going on down there with the little ones. He loved children. He did not understand this, I think you do. He did not lift up a child because children are 100% purely good and innocent and unselfish and meek. I don't know any of those children. But I know children that are far more interesting. They're generous and selfish. They are naughty and nice. They are loud and quiet. Children are feisty, clever, fierce, curious. Children are both exhilarating and exhausting. All those things. And so Jesus picks up into his arms and welcomes a child. Who is the greatest? I can guarantee you that question never gets old because people still ask it today. Who is the greatest? For Jesus, it's a faith question. It's not the way the rest of the world asks it, but for Jesus, it's a faith question. The question is, who is the greatest? And Jesus says, here. And he holds up a child. Here is the greatest. Why a child? I can think of 3 reasons. Let me just list them briefly. Number 1, little. Jesus doesn't show the child as an example of humility or of innocent, but as an example of little. Of little. The little ones, the insignificant ones. Welcome these, he says. Welcome these who are outside your usual circle. Welcome those who seem invisible to everybody else. Welcome them, and then you are welcoming me. Second, why a child? Children, more than adults, can be astonished and amazed. Mike Yaconelli, a youth minister of a few years ago, says that Jesus comes to rescue us from listlessness as well as lostness. He advocated the way children can teach us to be astonished. One of my granddaughter's first words when she was about 1 year old, one of the first words was, wow. She would see all these things that amazed her, and she would say, still does, she'll say, wow. Children have a great imagination. Children will ask questions, unlike those disciples. They're not afraid to ask questions, even awkward questions, anytime, any place, in front of anybody. Why a child? Wow. And thirdly, why a child? You can't help but remember Christmas today, that when God sent the Messiah was born. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords would be a little baby in a manger. Jesus was once a child in a specific place, in a specific house, with specific parents, living in a specific town where most people probably ignored him, as well as his brothers or sisters. And at the end, Jesus would be captured and bound up. Helpless as a child. That's what the world would make him at the end, as helpless as a child. And they would nail him to the cross, and he could have called down the powers of heaven, but he did not. Instead, Jesus stayed vulnerable, helpless as a child, in the face of worldly power and worldly greatness. Jesus laid aside his own status, and he came to serve. He came to bring to us forgiveness, mercy, and the love of God. He brings us those gifts, and somehow, he says, welcoming children is welcoming Jesus and the gifts of the cross that he brings. And the resurrection? Well, let me close with a story. It's a nighttime story. I don't know if you know this or not, but bedtime is a bad time for kids. No kid understands that logic. No kid understands having to go to bed when there's still energy in the body. Why would you do that? Well, Max Lucado writes about tucking his little daughters into bed one night. He was trying to get them to go to sleep. He tucked them into bed, gave them a kiss, said, "Now let's go to sleep. Good night." And one of his daughters said, "Daddy, I can't wait until I wake up." Jesus had the same thought in that tomb. Jesus thought, I can't wait until I wake up. And he did. And we shall. Amen.